Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mel Sherwood, and for the past 10 years, I've been working with entrepreneurs, business leaders, and their teams, helping them to present and communicate with more confidence. In this series of conversations, I'll be speaking with some of my favorite professional speakers. They'll be sharing a bit about how they came to be a professional speaker and also giving us some advice and tips on how we can all become better communicators. My guest today is the award-winning author of The Busy Person's Guide to Great Presenting. He's been a sales director at News International, the publishers of the Times newspaper, and it also worked as a professional magician and mind reader. An expert in persuasive communication, for the past 12 years, he's been a keynote speaker trusted by many of the world's leading brands to help them become more connected, more compelling, and more confident. He's also the most recent recipient of the UK's highest accolade for public speaking, the Professional Speaking Award of Excellence. So I know he's going to share some great value with us today, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Lee Warren. Thank you, Lee, and welcome.
Hi, Mel. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm absolutely so delighted that you could be with me today. I want to find out first, how did you end up as a professional speaker?
Well, it's my route's a bit different to a lot of people, I think, because I think the classic story of professional speakers is people saying, "Oh, I was at an event once and I saw somebody on stage and I thought I want to do that." And mine was almost the opposite. It was I've been a professional performer all of my life, so I've always been on stages ever since I was a child. And then in the late noughties, one of my best friends and I, we set up a business, and we didn't really know what we were doing. It was just a sort of training business, but we didn't really know what it was. And it was going all right, but not brilliantly. And I just had an idea one night. Why don't we just put on an event in central London and just talk about, why don't I just talk about some of my ideas? And, you know, we might pick up a few training clients. And we put on this event, and I learned one really important thing. Actually, I learned two important things that night. So one is it's the title that sells almost anything. So we gave it a good title, and lots of people came. And anyway, I sort of stood there and talked about some of our ideas. And at the end, there's something which I'm now very familiar with as a speaker, but I wasn't prepared for then, which is you always get this queue of people who've loved it, right? You just get the queue. I now call it capital T, capital Q. And the first person said, and I'm not making this up, she said, "Oh, I really enjoyed that. Would you come and do that in our business?" And I said, "Do what?" And she said, "What you just did." And I basically said, "But I just said some words in a certain order." and my then business partner, who's much more commercially savvy than me, he sort of stepped in at that point. He realized, oh, okay, that, you know, there's something here, and he took the conversation. And then the next person in the queue said about the same thing, and by the time the third person said something like that, I realized, and that was it. That was my new career found me.
Wow, you were certainly onto something. And since then, obviously, you've written at least one book that I know of, and that is called The Busy Person's Guide to Great Presenting. Now, in that book, you talk about the MAP process. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the reason the book's called The Busy Person's Guide to Great Presenting is I became very aware, you know, the world's getting busier and busier, and there are a lot of people who have to present or have to communicate in ways that are compelling and engaging, but either they're naturally not very good at it, or they'd rather do anything else, but it's a non-negotiable part of quite often of their work, of their professional lives. So I wanted to try and take everything I knew about communicating and presenting and put it in a quite a systematic way, so that it's very, very simple and easy to follow. So the acronym MAPS just stands for message, audience, and presenter. And as far as I could tell, these are the three essential things you have to have a great communication. So you've got to have it sounds a bit banal paraphrase, but you've got to have a really good message. That message has got to be dead right for the interests and needs of the audience. It has to speak to them. And last of all, you've got to, as a presenter, you've got to be able to convey that message to the audience. But the other reason that I did it in that order is I really wanted the presenter, MAP, I wanted the presenter to be at the end of that. Because for a lot of people, I think a lot of people in their mind think, if only my presentation skills were better, I'd be a better presenter. And my experience actually is quite the opposite, that most of the time it's the message that needs to be better. Most audiences don't care that much about your presentation skills. They're not worried if you and ah. They don't care if you miss a slide out. They're not that bothered whether you construct beautiful sentences. They just want to know what is this message and is it good for me?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in a lot of my workshops, and you may have this discussion in yours as well, I talk about what's the most important element of any pitch or presentation. Is it the content, the audience, or the presenter? And so there's a lot of debate that goes around that. And, by what you're saying, yes, the content is quite key. We know it's not about us, but I always argue the point that actually it is the audience that's the most important part of it, because if you don't know who your audience is, you can't craft that message to make it relevant and engaging for them. So we have to put them first. And you would agree with that, I'm sure.
100%. I mean, if you were to take 100 people on the street and say, tell me the best business presentation you've ever seen, 99 of those people would say Apple, right? 99 of those people would say the Apple product launches, they're as good as business presentations get. But the only reason not the only reason, but the main reason they're good is that they're good for that audience. That there are hundreds of people, they're excited, they're quite young, they're tech savvy. If they did those presentations to 6 84-year-olds, right? Those presentations would look terrible because they wouldn't be right for the audience.
Yeah, totally agree. Now, something else that's in your book that I find quite intriguing, and I think that our listeners and viewers will as well, is you talk about a ham pie and how that can make your message more persuasive. So tell us about the ham pie.
So again, ham pie is another acronym I created to try and boil down some really essential ideas about persuasive communication into a form that's very easy to remember and to use. So ham stands for hearts and minds. And the very basic idea is that broadly, as far as we can tell from psychology, across culture, across gender, across the planet, across age, the human decision-making process seems to be, when we're deciding whether to believe someone's idea or whether to listen to someone or whether to essentially buy their idea, the decision-making process seems to be that we make that decision emotionally first, and then we justify it rationally second. And so everybody listening to this will have had an experience. You watch a good friend run a meeting and they say something and they've got something wrong, but you give them the benefit of the doubt because you already know them and you like them and you trust them, and your brain just says, oh, they've made a rare mistake on this occasion. Conversely, you watch somebody present or run a meeting who you really don't like and you don't trust, and your brain's just looking for those moments, and if they've got a really strong, good argument, you're still trying to find reasons not to believe it. So ham is hearts and minds. In other words, to be a great communicator, you've got to get that emotional connection, at least as much as the mind stuff. So the mind stuff is data, content, statistics, processes, systems. And the mistake I see people, especially in professional communication, make again and again and again is that they use their mind stuff far too early or far too much in their argument and in their presenting and in their communication. And they hope that on its own will be persuasive. Mm-hmm. And then PIE stands for some really good ways to get that. So P is for pictures, and pictures is obviously videos and photos, but pictures also is stories, narratives, quick little anecdotes, comparisons, metaphors, analogies. Basically, very persuasive people talk in visual language. I stands for interest. So again, coming back to the audience, you've got to focus what you're saying on what's interesting and relevant to the audience. And then E is for enthusiasm. Basically, if you're going to be persuasive and a good communicator, you've got to persuade yourself first. So there, very briefly, is half a day workshop, Mel.
Love it. You're giving away all your secrets now. But actually, what you've just demonstrated is a really powerful way to communicate information, in that you've shortened it, you've brought it into easily memorable chunks of information. And so I think that's something that we can all learn just in the way that you've kind of articulated that as well. So you yay. So you had mentioned before about one of the biggest mistakes being that people go for the detail and the data and whatever before they capture the hearts of people. What are some of the other mistakes that you see people make when they're presenting?
The single biggest mistake is lack of preparation. Without any doubt. I mean, I get this question over and over again. What's the low-hanging fruit, Lee? What one thing can I do that would make me a better communicator, a better presenter? And preparation every single time is the answer. And what's fascinating is, and I'm really stubborn with this now. I mean, I've been doing it quite a long time now, so I'm quite confident in my own ability to put my foot down and say, no, this is the way it is. But a phrase I hear over and over again is people saying, I'm better in the moment. I don't want to do all this stuff because I'm better in the... And nobody, absolutely nobody is better in the moment. People tell themselves they're better in the moment afterwards because we're very good at photoshopping reality. And one of the things I always say to people who say they're better in the moment is how do you know? right? You haven't got that really well prepared version of yourself to watch alongside your in the moment version of yourself. And I'm not advocating in any way. I don't think people should learn scripts. I don't think people should prepare every second of their communication. What I mean by preparation is two things. First of all, as deep as possible an understanding of the people you're trying to communicate with, so your audience in its broadest sense. So the more every minute you spend on getting to know your audience better will pay dividends in your communication. And then the second thing is I'm very, very fond of structures. I use structures all the time in my own communicating, and I teach them all the time. So by preparation, I mean at a very basic level, at a really banal level, you have to know how you're going to start, you have to know how you're going to finish, and you have to know the journey between beginning and ending. You can't wing that stuff in real time. Nobody can do that, really.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you on all of those points. I actually talk about 3 Ps. So preparation plus practice, which we're going to get onto afterwards, and passion, which is your enthusiasm. And I know you don't necessarily like the word passion, but it fitted in with my 3 Ps, and the 3 of those add up to what I call presentastic or pitch-tastic. But the preparation, quite often people think about the idea that when they prepare, if they think of preparing at all, they think about what they're going to say. But they don't think about the other things to prepare, such as the environment, understanding where you're going to be, how many people there are going to be there, and all of that sort of thing, as well as preparing themselves. And I'll ask you a little later about how you prepare physically and mentally and that sort of thing in order to give your best on the day. So I think that's
it's really interesting. You say, people think about what they're going to say. And actually, I think it's a mark of bad communicators. But what bad communicators think to themselves, what do I want to say? And what's the best way to say it? Right? Great communicators think, who is the audience and what do they need to hear in order to get the result I want? That's how a good communicator thinks. They're very audience focused.
Yeah, you and I are singing from the same hymn sheet, it seems. Of course we would be. That's what we do. So I'm sometimes asked, and you might be as well, people say to me, well, I'm not going to be able to remember it. And this is why people shove so much stuff on their slides, because they think the slides are for themselves as the presenter and not actually to enhance the audience's understanding of the message. But what's your take on using notes to keep people on track?
I think you need to use whatever you need to make yourself feel comfortable. Communicating isn't a memory test, and it depends a bit on the environment. Again, it comes back to this thing. If you're ever in any doubt, I think about should I do this or should I do that, just think to yourself, if I was sitting in the audience, what would be good for me? Right? Would I rather watch someone who's nervous and sweating and clearly desperately trying to remember everything? Or would I be happy watching someone who's holding some notes in their hand, or even occasionally walks back to a lectern and checks their notes? Almost all of us would prefer the latter. And if I have to do like most professional speakers, I have my speech marks, my keynote. So I have 2 or 3 things that I know very, very well, and I adapt those slightly to different clients. So with those, it's fairly easy for me. But occasionally I have to do something new and pretty much completely new. So I might be asked to design and deliver a 60-minute thing, and it's just me talking. I'll definitely use notes the first few times I do that. 100% I will. I won't put them on the slides. I think that's bad practice, because it's basically that tells the audience I can't be bothered to do the work in advance. But I'll definitely have some notes in my hand. And what I do is I rehearse. And when I first rehearse, I'll make some notes. I always make them on index cards, and then I tie that legal bit of string, that green bit of string in the corner, because that means even if I drop them in real time, they're still in the right order. And what I do is I'll try and put as little as I can get away with, but enough to make me feel safe on the card. So my first iteration, with a Sharpie, I'll write a sort of key word at the top. So let's say, for example, my keyword might be persuasion. And then if it was the first time I was ever doing ham pie, I might write ham, H equals hearts, A equals and, M equals minds. And then after my first rehearsal, I might think, actually, I don't need all of that text. So the second version, my notes might just say persuasion, and then it might just say ham pie underneath in biro. And so I'm basically dialing down the notes I need. But I definitely, if you're walking in front of other people, you need to feel in yourself, I can make this work, I can do this. And if you need some notes, then definitely use them.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I totally agree. And you can use notes really subtly. I know a friend of mine was doing a TEDx talk, and it was the first time ever she was speaking about this quite personal experience. and she was really, you know, quite anxious about it. But she had notes sitting over to one side on a table, and literally she had a moment where she totally forgot what she was going to say, strolled over, took a sip of water, glanced at the notes, walked back to the spot, and just continued on like it was part of the thing. And I think the thing is, if we show that we've forgotten or whatever, it's worse than actually just trusting that, you know, having a look at a note is fine. And as you said, audiences don't mind. What they do mind is if we stand there and we read it.
I think, I mean, reading text is sort of acceptable at academic conferences and serious research-based updates, where actually some of what we've said today might not be quite so relevant, because that's a very, very specific form of communicating. But I don't think, to be honest, you even need to be particularly subtle about notes and so on. In fact, I've worked with quite a few people where I've had to say versions of, don't try and hide it, right? If you've forgotten something, just say to the audience, oh, actually, sorry, I've forgotten. Let me just check what the next slide is, or let me just check what my next point is. Just tell them. We live in a world that craves authenticity. The one thing actually I would recommend not doing is I generally encourage people not to put notes in, if they're using PowerPoint. A lot of people type their notes in PowerPoint. I would strongly recommend not doing that, because you end up really reliant on some tiny comfort monitor somewhere. And I've seen people sort of really peering at screens trying to read their own notes. When you're forced to handwrite them on a bit of card, it naturally makes you edit them down to the minimum you can get away with.
Yeah, I agree, because in the moment, if we're nervous, the more text is there, the more we'll rely on it. We will read it, you know. So yeah, I can completely agree. So you talked before about rehearsing, when you're rehearsing, and I'd love you to expand a bit on what's the difference between practice and rehearsal.
You've done your research, haven't you? Because I wrote about that in my book. So practice basically is, well, so if you're, an analogy I often use is playing the piano, because I love playing the piano. So when you practice at the piano, what you'll do is you'll say, oh, here's a 2-minute long piece, and there's 6 bars that are really difficult. So I'm going to practice those 6 bars. I'm going to repeat those over and over until I'm happy they're good. And then I'll try another couple of bars. So in practicing, you're looking at moments, you're stitching stuff together, you're stopping and starting, you're saying, I'll do that again. In rehearsal, what you're trying to do is, as closely as possible, replicate the exact conditions you'll be under. So if I know I'm going to play the piano in public, which I do twice a year, and it makes me really nervous, and I deliberately do it because I want to remind myself what it feels like to be very nervous. If I'm rehearsing at the piano, right? Or if you're not a natural musician, playing music in public is terrifying, right? But if I'm rehearsing at the piano, what I'll do is I'll take my phone, I'll put it on a tripod, I'll press play, and I'll try as hard as I can to start that piece. And no matter what happens, I get to the end. Because the point of rehearsal is to bring out all the mistakes that are going to happen in real time. That's the whole point of it. And you've really only got 2 options. You either rehearse in advance or you rehearse in front of your audience, right? They are only 2 choices. So you might as well rehearse in advance. And when, both for myself, because I feel how difficult this is, but also when I work with clients and I run workshops, the one thing everybody tries to avoid is rehearsing. Everybody, you know, and I'll say, okay, it's time to rehearse. Let's see it. Let's start it and keep going. And people say, okay, well, and then they stop 2 minutes in and say, oh, actually, that wasn't the right way. And I have to say, keep going, because you have to feel, you have to feel that moment of difficulty, and you have to do that before you're in the room with real people, because that's how you get better.
Yeah, absolutely. And would you recommend having someone in watching your rehearsal and giving you feedback?
That's a really good question, actually. And I think the jury's a bit out on that. So I've got one, I think I mentioned this in my book. I've got one client who does it to stuffed toys. I remember her telling me this. She gets she's got a few stuffed toys at home, and she puts them on a sofa so that she's got some eyes looking at her to create that slight, oh my God, people are staring at me feeling. So I think it can be very, very useful. I think it can be particularly useful if you're doing team presentations and pitches where you're going to have to practice handing over to each other. So yes, generally, yes, that can be useful. However, on the subject of feedback, there's a lot of bad feedback in the world and a lot of useless feedback in the world. And a lot of people don't know how to give feedback. So what I would strongly recommend is, if you are asking people to watch you rehearse, is tell them exactly the kind of feedback you need. What you don't want, you don't need people saying things to you like, I'm not sure red suits you, you know, or, you know, you ummed and ahed at that moment. So you need to tell people, look, I'm presenting to a C-suite board. They'll be focused on, is this this presentation compelling? Can I, do I feel trustworthy when I'm asking for the money? Do you feel like I'm reassuring you that I'll make this project work? That's the kind of feedback that you need. You don't need people telling you stuff about you ummed and ahed, or it just knocks your confidence too much, and it's useless feedback.
Yeah. No, really, really good advice there. So someone asked in our community is asked about the best way to end a presentation without saying thank you. Have you got any suggestions?
I do. Yes, I do. So in the structure outline in my book, I strongly recommend everybody should have what I call a punchline. And a punchline is not the opposite of a joke, but a punchline is a final closing statement that clearly says to the audience, this is it, I'm done, my message is finished, it's now over to you. And there are some really good reasons for doing this. One is it helps you to avoid that fading away that so many people seem to do, where they seem to say, so, they click and they say, and the thank you slide comes up.
Well, that's it then.
Well, thanks everyone. Having a punchline also helps you get over questions. So, you might have good questions, you might have bad questions, you might have provocative or difficult questions. If at the back of your mind, okay, I've got this difficult moment in my communication, but I know I'm heading somewhere. I know I'm heading to my punchline. It gives you a lot of confidence and can help you to get over that. So a punchline can be really simple. It can be something like, I'm glad we were all able to get together today. Don't forget the next meeting's Tuesday afternoon at 2, and we'll be in meeting room 2 along the corridor. Look forward to seeing you then. It can be really simple like that, or it can be really punchy. So it could be something like, look, we've had this same meeting now for 3 months in a row. You've got everything you need. You've got the funding. You've got the ideas. You've got my backing. The only question I'm leaving you with is, are you going to make this project happen? Let's hope I don't have to ask that question the next time we meet. Right. Yeah. So that's a really punchy punchline. And that's a real call to action. And between those two extremes, you definitely need some kind of punchline, and they're much stronger than just saying thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting when you were talking, you kind of wove in about the questions. And I always suggest to people not to have a Q&A after a presentation. If you can, make sure you've got something. And I'm seeing you're not heading, no. You obviously are familiar with that and agree with that. What are your thoughts on how to manage that Q&A?
Yeah, there are a few sort of things that appear to be the law until you challenge them. So one of those things is you must use PowerPoint, right? That seems to be the law. A second thing is your PowerPoint slides and your handout should be identical. That seems to be the law. And with all my clients, I challenge both those things. And then a third thing that seems to be the law is you do your presentation and then you have Q&A. And the reason that seems to be the law is just everyone's seen it that way. People think that's the way it should go. So if I'm taking a briefing call from a client, they'll always say something like, I'll say, how long have we got? And they'll say, you've got 40 minutes plus 15 minutes Q&A. And I'll instantly say, why don't I have 55 minutes and weave the Q&A throughout? And 99.9% of the time, clients say, oh, yeah, that sounds better. Thank you. And sometimes they'll say, would you be happy doing that? We'd love it if you could, because it seems to be like an additional skill or something. But from my point of view, it's much better for the audience and it's much better for me. But even if, let's say if somebody was really strict and they say, no, because of putting microphones around the room, we need you to do your thing and then stop, and then we'll do Q&A. Even then, I think you should prepare a final punchline message. So right at the end, when they say, oh, it's the last question, you take the last question, and then you say, thanks for your questions, everybody. Look, I just want to leave you with one final thought. ... And that's how you finish.
That could have been coming out of my mouth in every presentation skills program that I run, because I'm really, it is that people don't challenge. And I know that in some instances, the way things are set up, you can't avoid that. But I agree with you. You need to have that final thing, because we all know what happens at question time. It's either any questions, and then there's like nothing, because nobody's asking a question, and someone's, oh, is that you scratching your nose, or hand up, all of that stuff, and it's awkward. And then and people just say, oh, well, if there's no questions, thanks very much, and off they go, and they don't leave the audience with that key message that they wanted to give. And then the other thing, obviously, when Q&A happens and there's argumentative questions, or it's gone off on a tangent or whatever, and suddenly, oh, well, we're out of time, thanks very much for that, see you later. And again, you haven't left them with that final message. So I love that idea of coming back around and really leaving them with that final thought and that final punchline just to get that message across. That's what it's all about. There's no point us speaking if we don't actually communicate the message and have it remembered.
Absolutely. And your message isn't for you. You know your message, right? The message is entirely for the audience. And there's a lovely way, by the way, of dealing with that, what I call the question pause, you know, that moment where somebody says any questions and there's that awful pause. And often the pause is caused not because there aren't questions, it's because it's occurred too quickly. People haven't quite been able to formulate the question in their own minds. So one of the ways I love dealing with that is I'll ask myself a question. So, you know, if somebody says any questions, and if there's a 3-second pause, I'll say, well, you know, what a lot of people might be thinking at the moment is, or might be wondering at the moment is, ... And I'll ask myself a question I know lots of audiences ask. And that's a nice way to get over that question pause.
Yeah, I do that as well. You know, I might say I'm often asked whether ... And then you just ask the question. And people don't want to be the first to get the ball rolling sometimes. So, and sometimes, you know, people are happy to sort of have a plant, one person who gets the questions rolling, and then other people will ask. So something came to my mind about, we were talking about that. Oh, yes, we were talking about, you know, making sure your message is remembered. What are some of the techniques you use to make sure that your message is remembered?
There are lots of classic techniques from the ancient art of rhetoric, first laid down by Aristotle. If anybody wants to be a better communicator, definitely read Aristotle's The Poetics. It's much more readable than you might imagine it is, and it's still the foundation of everything that came afterwards. So a few classic techniques are repetition is a great way of making things remembered, and repetition in threes particularly. Using a few rhetorical techniques such as alliteration and assonance can you know, if you think across the 20th century, all the memorable messages, all of them use some really strong rhetorical techniques. You know, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. Classic Greek rhetorical technique. Martin Luther King used alliteration a lot, for example. All of those great rallying cries. So that's a good thing to do. Whether the research is really robust on it, I'm not sure, but certainly in psychology, a very famous thing is what's called the primacy and recency bias. So effectively, primacy and latency bias, whatever. Anyway, basically what you hear at the beginning of end of messages, you'll tend to more likely remember. I can't remember the official name for it. So if recency,
because it's a more recent thing that you've heard.
That's right.
Last thing, yeah.
Primacy and recency. And so generally it's a good idea, try and get your main message fairly early and definitely repeat it near the end. The most important thing. And the other thing is, and this is not a classical rhetorical technique, but it's very useful, is try and get the audience engaged in something you want them to remember in some way. And you can do this in keynotes. It's sort of a mark of my keynote speaking. I never go more than 10 minutes without the audience doing something. And that something might just be turning to their neighbor. It might be asking them to write something down. It might be asking them to address a rhetorical question. Because audiences can argue with you, but they can't argue with their own experience. So if you help them to have an experience of what you want them to remember, that's much more likely to be a memorable message.
That's gold. That's a really good piece of advice. I totally agree. So now, I know you have a background as a performer, so you've always been probably conscious of the need to warm up before you get in front of an audience. And I remember when I studied performing arts, one of the best things I learned was the phrase, never warm up on your audience's time. And I've taken that with me and I carry that all the time because, you know, it's our job as a presenter or a speaker or whatever to be at our peak at the moment we're in front of that audience. And so you have something in your book that you talk about, the 1 minute warm up, and very good for busy people because I like to do a little longer than a minute, but I know that other people don't have the time or the inclination, but I totally agree that we should be encouraging people to do some kind of warm up to get into the zone, just like a sports person would do or a performer. So talk to us about your 1 minute warm up.
Yeah, it's a beautiful articulation of it, Mel. Thank you. I mean, the reason I created the 1 minute warm up is exactly like you. So personally, I could easily do a half-hour long warm up, and I enjoy it. But I realized I was teaching some of those ideas to people, and they just weren't practical. There's at a real life, you know, meeting, presentation, conference, nobody is going to go off and find a private room and do a 20-minute long warm up for themselves. I mean, maybe if it's a sort of shareholder changing. Maybe the Apple product launches, maybe they do all get in the room and do a 20-minute warm-up, but it's very rare anybody has the luxury. So I wanted to create something that was very easy to do, that you definitely would do, and you could do anywhere, even just walking along a corridor. So the 1-minute warm-up is basically just finding yourself a moment. You make sure that you're standing, that your body is balanced evenly, so you let some muscular strain fall away from your body, you let some stress fall away. Then I suggested a couple of very quick vocal things that people can do to warm their voices up. So just a gentle M sound, like you're sinking into a hot, warm bath, or in my case, eating plain, dark, organic chocolate. And that's just to get the resonance, the warmth at the front of your face, because generally people who are persuasive and compelling tend to have quite resonant voices. They don't have strained voices generally. And then I've suggested a couple of words with M's and N's in them, like marmalade and mademoiselle, because that again increases. Say it again?
Or Melanie.
Oh, Melanie. Yes, of course, Melanie. But the sentence I created, because I just realized it makes me laugh and it makes everybody laugh. And who doesn't benefit from laughing just before you present or communicate, is I suggested the sentence, remember the money. And I get everybody to say that about 2 minutes before they present, and that warms your voice up, but it puts you in a really good mood.
Yeah.
And then if anyone's nervous, just very quickly naming the nerves, I found does a lot to. Nobody gets rid of their nerves, but just naming them, just saying, oh, okay, my hands are shaking, or my heart's beating fast, or I've got butterflies again, or my neck's getting red, whatever it is, it just slightly helps to put it in perspective a bit. It takes the power out of it a little bit. And then the very last thing is I strongly recommend saying out loud the first thing you'll say when you're walking into that room or when you're walking on stage, even if it's really simple, like good afternoon, thanks for coming to the meeting today. Just say that out loud 2 or 3 times, puts you in a really good state. I remember when I was a teenage performer, a squeaky teenage cabaret performer, I used to do magic. I used to be a magician. And I was the warm-up act in the mid-1980s to quite a well-known comedian on the South Coast. And he used to do what I do professionally, which is wear a pocket square in his jacket. And one day I saw him getting ready, and it wasn't a handkerchief, it was a sock. He used to fold a sock up and put a sock in his top pocket. And I asked him, I said, why do you wear a sock on stage? And he said, because if you want to feel confident in life, you need to walk into rooms thinking, I know one thing nobody else does.
I love
Isn't that a great way of thinking?
I love that.
Yeah. And so doing your warm-up, it builds a little. You sort of think, oh, I've done. Nobody else has done. I've done this, and I know I've done this, and this is just for me. And when you walk into that space or walk on stage, you've just got that little. I'm ready for this, and
and
confidence is very charismatic. It's very attractive, and it builds on itself.
Yeah. Well, I am blown away by what you shared today. It's so valuable for people, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us, and those golden nuggets. I'm sure if people started to just even put 1 or 2 of those things into the way that they prepare and that they deliver presentations, then they will certainly take them to the next level. So thank you for that. How can people get to know more about you? How can they find you and your book and book you?
Oh, bless you. Well, here's my book, The Busy Person's Guide to Great Presenting. You can find that on Amazon very easily. And if you want to find me, LinkedIn is always the best. So if you typed Lee Warren speaker into LinkedIn, that's how. Actually, hang on. Here's a bit of presenting magic. You ready for this? Here's how you can find me. I wasn't ready for that. I had to find it on my computer somewhere, but Lee Warren speaker, that's how you can find me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much for your time and for so generously sharing your wisdom and experience and advice. And I'm sure people will get a great deal from it. So thank you.
Real pleasure. Lovely to chat to you, Mel.